Dawn comes slowly to the Sahel. A thin line of light breaks across the horizon, trembling over red dust and silent villages. The land seems to breathe, neither asleep nor awake, caught in the quiet moment before a new day decides what it will become. For decades, this belt of sand and scrub was spoken of as an afterthought, a distant margin of the continent, a place to be managed, stabilized, assisted. But something in the air has changed. The wind carries a different weight now, an unease, a reckoning, a question rising from the soil itself. Why has a region once dismissed as peripheral become the crossroads of a new geopolitical imagination? The old arrangements no longer satisfy. Security delivered from afar dissolved like footprints in the sand. Promises made in polished offices never reached the villages waiting in the heat. And so the Sahel began to shift, not in a single moment, but in the slow, grinding way tectonic plates move beneath the earth. At the center of this awakening stands a young generation, and among them a figure whose name travels across the dunes of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore. Not as a savior, but as a symbol of a region asking to stand on its own feet. Stay with this story, because the Sahel is no longer being shaped, it is shaping back. The Sahel did not arrive at its turning point through noise. It arrived through exhaustion, slow, heavy, and undeniable. For years, the region lived inside a paradox. Responsibility without power, expectation without tools, danger without the means to confront it. Governments came and went. Agreements were signed and repeated. Uniforms changed, flags changed, mission names changed, yet the condition of the land did not. Villages waited for security that moved like a distant mirage. Cities waited for investment that never crossed the desert wind, and entire generations grew up believing that safety, dignity, and direction were things that must be imported. This long dependency created a habit, the instinct to look outward before looking inward. But habits break the moment they become unbearable. The break began quietly. Communities in the Sahel began asking questions they had not dared to ask aloud. Why does security remain fragile when so many foreign boots walked our soil? Why do our resources leave the land, yet the land itself remains hungry? Why do the promises of partnership feel like the promises of rain, spoken often, arriving rarely? These questions did not come from ideology. They came from lived experience, carried in the eyes of farmers who had seen too many seasons spoiled, mothers who had fled too many times, and the youth who saw their future shrinking to the width of a dusty road. As these questions gathered force, something shifted within the region's leadership. A younger generation of officers, administrators, and thinkers began to step forward. People who had grown up seeing the failures of old arrangements not through textbooks, but through the windows of their childhood homes. They were not moved by nostalgia for past empires, nor by hostility toward distant powers. They were moved by the simple truth that what had been offered was no longer enough. Among the voices rising in this moment was one that traveled far, the voice of a soldier from Burkina Faso, known in some corners as Ibrahim Traoré. His message struck a chord not because it promised miracles, but because it articulated what the region had been whispering for years. The Sahel cannot rely on strategies crafted by those who do not walk its soil. This sentiment became the hinge on which an entire region began to turn. The pivotal shift was not military, nor economic, nor diplomatic. It was psychological. The Sahel stopped framing itself as a zone to be stabilized and began imagining itself as a region with agency, a region capable of choosing, rejecting, negotiating, redefining, a region that could cultivate its own doctrines instead of borrowing ones that did not fit its terrain. Out of this mindset came a new vocabulary. Words like self-reliance, strategic autonomy, dignity through responsibility, partnership over dependence. They spread from political chambers to street corners, from universities to cattle markets, until even the wind seemed to repeat them. Then came the moment of realization. The old alliances had been built on the assumption that the Sahel would always be grateful, always compliant, always waiting. The new alliances, those being shaped quietly across deserts and river basins, were built on something different, mutual interest rather than inherited obligation. And so the Sahel began to open its doors. Not with fanfare, not with declarations, but with a calm and deliberate shift. New dialogues formed with powers that had once stood at the periphery of African geopolitics. The region started seeking partners who offered technology rather than lectures, investment rather than oversight, respect rather than conditionality. The goal was not to replace one patron with another, but to diversify, to ensure that no single hand could tighten the grip on its future. This turning point brought with it both excitement and uncertainty. Excitement because for the first time in decades, the Sahel felt the possibility of ownership, of shaping its own architecture of security, trade, and diplomacy. Uncertainty because every choice carried weight. New partners brought new opportunities, but also new risks. Old partners watched the shift with concern, sometimes with misunderstanding, sometimes with resentment. Yet the Sahel continued forward, not out of defiance, but out of clarity. The status quo had already failed. In dusty command posts, young officers revised doctrines long inherited from distant academies. In classrooms, students debated concepts of sovereignty their parents had never been encouraged to explore. In marketplaces, traders welcomed goods arriving through new routes. And in the hearts of millions, the idea of a region standing upright began to take root. This was the central turning point, not a single event, but a gradual realization shared across borders, a collective awakening to the fact that the Sahel's future could no longer be outsourced. It had to be authored from within, but every turning point casts a shadow. And as the Sahel stepped into this new chapter, a pressing question emerged, one that would shape the next moves of every power paying attention. If the region is learning to choose for itself, who will try hardest to influence the choices? And in that widening space of new possibilities, what force first reached out its hand? Emotion does not erupt all at once. In the Sahel, it rises like heat from the earth, slow, invisible at first, then overwhelming. The earliest tremors came from the groups the world rarely listens to, the shepherd who has walked the same dry paths for 20 years, the mother who has learned to recognize danger by the silence of birds, the young man who has never seen stability last longer than a season. These voices do not speak in policy terms, they speak in pulses, anger, fatigue, yearning. The anger was old. It came from decades of promises scattered like seeds on barren soil. Villages had been told that safety was coming, yet the night still belonged to uncertainty. Camps had been told that help would arrive, yet the horizon remained empty. People were taught to wait for the foreign convoy, the foreign advisor, the foreign solution. Eventually, waiting itself became a wound. From that wound grew the second emotion, regret. Regret for the years built upon hope that did not materialize. Regret for depending on strategies drafted in faraway capitals by people who would never feel Sahelian heat on their skin. Regret for trusting in structures that asked for patience but never offered empowerment. This regret was not quiet. It echoed through marketplaces, across desert crossings, through the shaded courtyards where elders sit and remember. The elders spoke of past alliances, of expectations once bright, of partnerships that ended with more loss than gain. Their stories built a bridge of understanding for the younger generation, which looked around and wondered, if the model we inherited does not protect us, then why do we remain loyal to it? At this point, emotion reached its breaking line. Out of the tension between anger and regret, a new feeling surfaced, sharper, clearer, almost electric, the conviction that the region must rise on its own terms. This was the emotional peak, the moment when the Sahel stopped whispering its doubts and began speaking its desires aloud. Citizens who once feared speaking critically started asking direct questions. Why should external doctrines determine how the Sahel defends itself? Why should decisions about its resources be shaped by those who do not inhabit its land? Why should its young accept a future dictated by the memory of someone else's empire? These questions were not rebellious, they were rational. And as they spread, something extraordinary happened. The Sahel began to see itself differently. Communities long divided by borders suddenly discovered a shared rhythm. From the dunes of northern Mali to the scrublands of southern Burkina Faso, conversations carried the same theme. If dignity is universal, then dependency cannot be permanent. In tea houses and bus stations, people debated ideas once reserved for think tanks: sovereignty, self-reliance, multipolar alliances, autonomy. The youth, especially, embraced this moment. They had grown up in a world where digital landscapes connected them across frontiers. They had seen narratives of empowerment arise across the global south, and they were tired of being portrayed as victims waiting for rescue. They wanted to be authors. This desire created a surge of hope, not blind hope, but the kind that comes from recognizing one's own strength. It was hope built on the simple belief that the Sahel deserved to negotiate, not beg, to choose, not react, to lead, not follow. At the cultural level, this emotional awakening took on symbolic form. Artists painted maps of the region without arrows pointing inward. Musicians wrote songs about horizons widening, not closing. Poets described the Sahel not as the world's burden, but as the world's reminder that resilience is a form of knowledge. This cultural wave amplified the political pulse. Leaders who echoed the people's frustrations gained legitimacy. Those who clung to the old scripts lost their audience. The region began demanding leaders who spoke in a language of courage rather than caution, leaders who refused to apologize for wanting sovereignty. In this rising tide of new sentiment, one figure became a reference point, not as a myth, but as a mirror. The young captain from Burkina Faso, sometimes called Traoré, whose ascent embodied the emotional transformation of the region. His message resonated not because of charisma, but because it aligned perfectly with the collective heartbeat of the Sahel. We must build security that understands our terrain, alliances that respect our dignity, futures that reflect our own decisions. Whether one admired him or criticized him, his influence was undeniable. He became a symbol around which the region organized its feelings: frustration at the past, determination in the present, ambition for the future. By the time this emotional peak settled into place, the Sahel was no longer simply a region under pressure. It was a region awakening, recognizing the power hidden beneath its hardships. A region ready to craft alliances not through desperation, but through choice. A region that had stopped asking, "Who will save us?" and had begun asking, "Who will walk with us on equal ground?" And then, as if carried by the desert wind, a deeper question drifted into every conversation, every campfire, every council of elders. If emotion has awakened the Sahel, what will action make of it? And when hope finally stood upright, the region turned to confront the next challenge. What does life look like after the turning point? Life in the Sahel did not transform with fanfare. It changed the way dawn changes a landscape. Quietly at first, then unmistakably. After the emotional awakening, the region entered a new kind of season, a season defined not by weather, but by responsibility. Communities who had spent years waiting for others to act realized that the next chapter would be written with their own hands. The question was no longer, who will intervene for us? It had become, how do we rebuild ourselves? In the towns that dot the edge of the desert, the first signs of this shift appeared in the smallest places. A repaired well, restored by local labor rather than an international contractor. A night patrol formed by villagers who refused to let fear remain the ruler of their evenings. Youth groups gathering beneath thorn trees to discuss the future of their communes with a seriousness once reserved for parliament halls. Little by little, these acts stitched together a wider transformation. For the first time in a long time, people felt they could influence the direction of their societies, not through declarations, but through the daily discipline of reclaiming agency. Across the region, informal assemblies began to form. Farmers spoke of markets they wanted to build. teachers debated how to protect schools from instability. Local leaders explored how to resolve disputes through dialogue rather than dependence. There was a sense that the Sahel was not only defending itself, it was redefining itself. And then there was the matter of alliances. Where once foreign relationships had been inherited like old maps with faded borders, now they were examined with fresh eyes. Partnerships were no longer accepted simply because they were familiar. They were measured against a new metric. Does this relationship allow us to stand upright? This question reshaped how communities viewed the world. Across markets, someone could mention a new partner from the East and receive nods of curiosity rather than suspicion. In deserts, where caravans once carried salt, conversations now circled around technology, trade corridors, training exchanges. The winds of global change had reached the Sahel, but they were no longer blowing the region off balance. The region was learning to lean into them. Yet the transformation was not without weight. Responsibility does not arrive without cost. With sovereignty comes the burden of decision-making, and not all decisions are easy. Some wondered whether diversification of alliances would bring stability or simply new forms of entanglement. Others worried that internal unity might crack under the strain of ambition, and many feared that the world's giants, noticing the region's awakening, would attempt to pull it back into old patterns of influence. But the Sahel did not turn away from these fears. It faced them with a kind of quiet bravery, the bravery of people who had already survived the worst and refused to turn backwards. It was in this climate that voices of guidance emerged from within, not above. Among them was the young figure from Burkina Faso, a man whose journey from barracks to leadership became a metaphor for the region's own ascent. His name, Ibrahim Traore, surfaced in countless conversations, not as a portrait to be worshipped, but as a symbol of the possibility that a new generation could carry the weight of change. For many, he represented something the Sahel had been missing, the example of someone who did not fear speaking for himself, and by extension, speaking for the region. He embodied the idea that leadership is not inherited, it is claimed through clarity of purpose. Yet even he could not escape the truth that transformation must be collective. One leader can spark a movement, but only a people can sustain it. And sustain it they did. Local artisans began crafting tools instead of relying on imports. Women's cooperatives organized distribution networks for food and goods across insecure regions. Youth collectives built community-run training spaces, teaching one another skills from mechanics to digital literacy. These changes, though modest individually, accumulated into a powerful message. The Sahel was learning to depend on its own hands first, and still, the sand carried whispers of uncertainty. Would these new alliances respect the aspirations of the region? Would the old alliances adjust or attempt to pull the Sahel back into familiar dependency? Would the momentum endure once the excitement of the turning point faded? These questions were not answered in speeches or summits. They were answered each time a community restored a field abandoned by conflict, each time a village returned to its land, each time a region shaped an agreement not out of fear but out of confidence. For the Sahel, life after the turning point became a test, not of power, but of perseverance. It became a test of whether a region battered by drought, conflict, and neglect could craft a future rooted in dignity. And with every small success, hope deepened like a well whose water level rises slowly but surely after years of dryness. But as this new chapter unfolded, the world beyond the dunes began to stir. External powers took note of the Sahel's shift. Some with interest, some with caution, some with intentions not yet revealed. The region sensed it was no longer moving unseen, and so the next question rose from both the villages and the capitals. If we choose our partners now, what eyes are watching from the horizon? And beyond that horizon, what forces are quietly positioning themselves as the Sahel steps into its new identity? Beyond the dunes of the Sahel lies a world that rarely stays still. Great powers shift like constellations, forming new patterns, dissolving old ones, always watching the horizon for signs of movement. And now, for the first time in a long time, their gaze is fixed on a region they once overlooked. From the vantage point of distant capitals, the Sahel does not appear as a line of borders. It appears as a corridor, a stretch of earth connecting oceans, resources, trade winds, and futures. For decades, the world treated this corridor as a place to pass through, not a place to negotiate with. But the region's awakening changed the geometry of power. A landscape once seen as peripheral has become a crossroads where ambitions intersect. Some actors approach the Sahel with curiosity. They see a place eager for technology, infrastructure, and new forms of cooperation. They speak the language of partnership, of shared growth, of horizons wider than the desert itself. Others approach with caution. They see the Sahel shift as a sign that old influence is fading. They sense a region stepping beyond their familiar grasp, and the uncertainty unsettles them. Whispers travel through diplomatic circles, not as accusations but as questions. What direction will this awakening take? Whose values will shape its alliances? Which hands will hold the compass? A third group watches with calculation rather than curiosity or caution. To them, the Sahel is not merely changing, it is positioning itself. They recognize that partnerships formed now could echo for generations. They know that regions in motion become regions of strategic importance, and so they draw closer, offering deals, training, technology, investment, tools not merely to support but to influence. Amid these competing perspectives, one country becomes a reference point, Burkina Faso. Not because of its size, nor because of its wealth, but because it embodies the question the world is trying to answer. How does a nation reclaim its agency in a world shaped by giants? Its choices ripple beyond its borders, carried across sandstorms and savannas, reminding outsiders that sovereignty is not an abstract principle, it is a lived stance. For some global actors, this stance inspires respect. They see a region seeking dignity, not dominance. For others, it inspires unease. They wonder whether autonomy in the Sahel might inspire autonomy elsewhere, whether a single region's insistence on equal partnership could encourage others to demand the same. Yet the world, with all its ambitions and calculations, often forgets one truth. The Sahel is not a chessboard. Its people do not exist to be positioned by distant hands. Its future cannot be shaped by strategies written thousands of miles away. The region stands on its own ground, its own history, its own vision. And though outside forces gather around it, the Sahel now approaches them on different terms, not as a subject of their plans, but as a participant with its own. Still, the horizon is not without shadows. For every partner seeking cooperation, there may be another seeking advantage. For every open door, there may be a hidden cost. The Sahel must navigate these offers with a clarity forged from struggle, and as global forces draw closer, one question grows louder in the desert wind. If the world wants a place in the Sahel's future, what will the Sahel demand in return? And as choices expand, the region faces its most difficult question yet. Which path truly leads to sovereignty? The Sahel now stands at a forked road, not a crossroads of dust and stone, but a crossroads of meaning. For the first time in generations, the region is not being moved by the world. It is choosing how it wishes to move through the world. One path ahead is steep, carved into the side of a cliff. It asks the Sahel to build its own systems of security, its own chains of value, its own political compass. It promises dignity, but demands discipline. It offers autonomy, but requires sacrifice. It is the path of learning to walk without leaning on the shoulders that once claimed to protect. Another path gleams with easier light. It invites the region to maintain the familiar rhythm of dependence, old partnerships, old assurances, old structures dressed in new language. It asks for little today, but would cost much tomorrow. This is the path where sovereignty becomes a slogan rather than a practice. Between these two lies a third road, winding like a desert river. It urges diversification, many partners, many ties, many channels. This path does not choose sides, it chooses balance. It calls for a Sahel clever enough to collaborate widely, yet confident enough to preserve its core. For many, this middle route is the most realistic, the most adaptable, the most aligned with a region that has learned resilience through struggle. Whichever road the Sahel chooses, one truth is clear. The region can no longer be defined by external blueprints. It has tasted the idea of agency, and that taste does not fade. Across markets and ministries, across herding trails and university halls, the region's people have begun to speak a new vocabulary, not of obedience, but of ownership. Words like self-determination, once reserved for scholars, now travel through everyday conversations. Ideas like strategic autonomy are spoken by traders and farmers with the same confidence as diplomats. Children who once grew up hearing stories of foreign saviors now hear stories of local heroes, local solutions, local courage. But choosing a path is not enough. The Sahel must also defend the path it chooses. It must guard against internal fractures, political, ethnic, economic. It must resist becoming a trophy for competing powers. It must ensure that alliances do not smother the very independence they promise to support. This is the delicate art of sovereignty, to reach outward without being pulled downward, to invite cooperation without surrendering authorship, to say yes to partners while still saying we decide. And beyond all strategic calculations lies a deeper question, the one whispered in courtyards, debated in tea houses, murmured on long bus rides across the dunes. Can a region long shaped by others finally shape itself? The answer will not come from treaties or handshakes. It will come from daily courage, from communities that refuse to yield their future, from leaders who honor the people instead of titles, from a generation determined to rewrite the Sahel's position in the world. The road ahead is uncertain, but uncertainty is not the enemy. The only true enemy is the belief that the Sahel must remain what it has always been. If the region continues on its chosen trajectory, then a new chapter opens, one in which sovereignty is not an aspiration, but a habit, not a slogan, but a structure, not a dream, but a discipline. And as the Sahel steps forward, a final question rises like heat from the desert floor. Is the world prepared for a region that no longer asks permission to stand? The story of the Sahel is no longer a story of crisis. It is a story of awakening, a slow, determined rising from the dust. For decades, the region was framed through the lens of what it lacked: stability, resources, influence, direction. But in this new chapter, the world begins to see what the Sahel always possessed: resilience strong enough to outlive empires, memory deep enough to recognize repeating patterns, and courage quiet enough to survive when no one was watching. A transformation of this scale does not happen in isolation. It echoes across a continent that has long waited for a shift in the winds. From the Atlantic coast to the highlands of the east, people sense that the Sahel is not just reshaping alliances, it is testing the idea that Africa can negotiate with the world on its own terms. In courtyards where elders gather, conversations drift toward dignity rather than dependency. In classrooms, students speak about sovereignty as a daily practice, not a distant ambition. In markets, traders discuss partnerships with a confidence that suggests something fundamental has changed in the region's posture. And at the center of this momentum stands a truth older than borders. Africa does not rise through isolation. It rises through clarity, the clarity of knowing that alliances must serve the people, not swallow them, that development must strengthen identity, not dilute it, that security must grow from within, not hover above like a shadow. The Sahel's emergence is therefore more than a regional event. It is a signal flare, a message sent across dunes and oceans. We are no one's periphery. We are participants in our own future, yet the journey ahead is not without uncertainty. Every choice will test the region's balance between ambition and caution, between welcoming partners and guarding autonomy. Sovereignty is not a destination, it is a discipline that must be renewed each day. But if the Sahel continues to walk with purpose, not rushed, not coerced, but steady, then a greater story comes into view. A continent remembering its voice, a people reclaiming their narrative, a future crafted not from inherited paths, but from chosen ones. And so we close with a question that reaches far beyond the Sahel's borders. If one region can reshape the alliances that once defined it, what might happen when the entire continent decides to do the same?